By 1966, America had already decided what kind of performance car it wanted, and the answer was becoming crystal clear with every monthly sales report that landed on the desks of Ford executives in Dearborn, Michigan. The Mustang was selling like nothing the automotive world had ever seen before. Intermediates like the Pontiac GTO were dominating the muscle car conversation, and the writing was slowly, but surely, appearing on the wall for the full-size performance car. But Ford was not ready to wave that white flag just yet. Instead, they did something bold and calculated. They launched an entirely new model, fitted it with a brand new engine that had never appeared in a production car before, dressed it up with luxury appointments that no other muscle car of the period could match, and then gave it a name so deliberately attention-grabbing that it practically dared you to ask questions. That car was the 1966 Ford Galaxie 507 Litre. And yet, despite all of that ambition, despite all of that engineering, despite all of that marketing bravado, within a single model year, it was gone as a standalone model and quietly being folded away into the background of Ford's lineup, never to fully resurface. This is the story of why Ford built the 7-liter, what made it genuinely special, and why the people running the show in Dearborn ultimately decided they just could not afford to keep it alive. But real quick before we start, comment the vehicle you want us to cover next. The comment with the most likes becomes our next video. Okay, let's get into it. To understand why the 7-liter existed at all, you have to understand what was happening to the full-size performance car in the years leading up to 1966. For the better part of the early 1960s, if you wanted serious straight-line performance, you went big. The era of the Galaxie 427, the Chevy 409 Impala, and the Chrysler 426 Max Wedge stuffed inside full-size bodies was still very much a reality in 1962 and 1963. These were massive cars with massive engines, and they dominated both the drag strip and the national headlines. Ford themselves had been deeply involved in this arms race, running their legendary 427 cubic inch big block in the full-size Galaxie to great effect, both on the strip and in NASCAR. The results spoke for themselves, but then something happened that changed everything. In April of 1964, Ford unveiled the Mustang to the world at the New York World's Fair, and the entire automotive industry felt the shockwave. In its first 12 months on sale, Ford sold over 417,000 Mustangs, a record that nobody in Detroit had seen before. Young buyers, who up until that point had been told they needed a big car with a big engine to make a performance statement, suddenly discovered that they could have more fun, more style, and nearly the same kind of performance for considerably less money in a smaller, lighter package, and at roughly $2,400 to start. The Mustang was almost impossibly affordable compared to the fully loaded full-size cars that were competing for the same emotional dollar. The same year the Mustang arrived, Pontiac unleashed their GTO, a mid-size car with a big block engine that borrowed Ford and GM's own strategy of stuffing serious power into a lighter body. The formula worked brilliantly. Suddenly, the full-size performance car started to feel like yesterday's news, and the sales numbers were beginning to reflect it. While Ford's total full-size production remained strong in raw numbers thanks to the sheer breadth of the Galaxie lineup, the performance-focused Galaxie XL, the sporty trim level that had historically attracted the more enthusiast-minded buyer, was already starting to lose ground to these younger, lighter, flashier alternatives. Ford's engineers and product planners knew they had to respond, but they also knew they could not simply abandon the full-size car. There was still a market for it, particularly among older, more established buyers who wanted the comfort of a large body combined with the thrill of genuine power under the hood. These were buyers who were not necessarily interested in the raw, stripped-down drag racing ethos of the 427. They wanted power, yes, but they also wanted power steering, air conditioning, automatic transmissions, and a car they could take to dinner on a Saturday night and actually feel comfortable in. The existing 427, as brilliant and violent as it was, could not be ordered with power steering, air conditioning, and or even the power assist for the new front disc brakes that Ford was planning for their top-tier models. It was simply too wild, too uncompromising, too much of a racer to be a luxury performance car. Enter the 428 cubic inch FE engine, a new big block that Ford was developing specifically to bridge the gap between brute performance and everyday usability. The 428 was built on the same basic FE engine family that had produced the legendary 406 and 427, sharing the same general architecture, the same distinctive overhead valve layout, and much of the same external appearance. But internally, it was a different animal, with a different mission. Where the 427 was built to rev, to breathe hard through special high-flowing heads, solid lifters, and aggressive cam profiles, but the 428 was engineered for torque, with a bore of 4.13 inches and a stroke of 3.98 inches. It displaced 428 cubic inches, the closest thing in metric measurement to exactly 7 liters, and that detail would not be lost on Ford's marketing department. The 428 ran hydraulic lifters instead of the 427's demanding solid lifter setup, which meant it was quieter, smoother, and far more tolerant of city driving and long highway cruises. In its standard street tune, the 428 produced 345 horsepower at 4,600 revolutions per minute, and perhaps more importantly, for a car of this size and weight, it produced a tremendous 462 foot-pounds of torque at just 2,800 revolutions per minute. That torque figure is what made the 7-liter feel so effortlessly powerful in normal driving. You did not need to rev this engine. You did not need to row through gears aggressively or hunt for a power band. You simply pressed the accelerator, and the car moved. Decisively, immediately, and with the kind of low-end authority that felt like the road itself was getting out of the way. Ford officially named the engine the Thunderbird 7-liter, a deliberately European-sounding designation that borrowed the prestige of the metric system to make the displacement sound exotic rather than just big. It was a marketing masterstroke, in an era when most Americans were still thinking in cubic inches. Branding the engine in liters made it sound like something you might find in a Ferrari or a Jaguar rather than a Dearborn production line. The 7-liter name was then carried over to the entire car, creating the Galaxie 500 7-liter as Ford's new flagship performance model, available exclusively in 2 body styles: the 2-door hardtop fastback and the 2-door convertible. Now, while the 428 was the standard engine, and the primary reason the car existed as a model at all, it was not the only engine option in the 7-liter's order book. Ford also offered the legendary 427 as a factory option, and this is where things get genuinely fascinating from a historical perspective. The 427 was available in 2 states of tune. The first was the single 4-barrel carburetor version coded as the Q code, rated at 410 horsepower, with a 10.9-to-1 compression ratio and solid lifters. The second was the dual-quad R-code version, featuring 2 massive 4-barrel carburetors mounted on a special cross-ram intake manifold, rated at 425 horsepower. Though most who have studied these engines closely agree that the actual output was well beyond that figure on a good engine. These were racing motors in every meaningful sense of the word, built with cross-bolted main bearing caps, special forged internals, and heads that flowed at a level the 428 could not come close to matching at high revolutions. The catch with the 427 was that its uncompromising nature meant it could only be mated to a 4-speed manual transmission. There was no automatic option, no power steering available, no air conditioning, and even the power assist for the standard front disc brakes was off the table. The car was also significantly more expensive to option this way. The R-code dual-quad 427 added $808 to the price of the 7-liter, at a time when that represented a genuinely substantial sum of money. Ford's internal production records, later confirmed by researchers at Marti Auto Works, reveal that across the entire 1966 7-liter production run, only 38 customers actually chose the 427 option. 38 out of 11,175 total 7-liters built. To put that in perspective, of the 2,368 7-liter convertibles produced, only 2 were delivered with the 427 and 4-speed combination, making those particular cars essentially one-of-a-kind artifacts today. The rest of the buying public made the predictable but completely sensible choice and took the 428, paired with Ford's C6 Cruise-O-Matic 3-speed automatic transmission that had been specially calibrated with higher gear ratios specifically for the 7-liter application. And that automatic was genuinely the right choice for how this car was designed to be used. The C6 was a remarkably robust unit, well suited to handling the torque of the big block without complaint, and the higher gear ratios Ford programmed into the 7-liter version helped keep the engine working efficiently in highway conditions. Standard rear axle ratios varied depending on the transmission and customer preference, with open and limited slip traction lock differentials available in several gear combinations. For the buyer who simply wanted to cruise, a 2.80 ratio kept the engine spinning lazily at highway speed. For the buyer who wanted to feel the 428's torque more aggressively off the line, steeper ratios were available, and the Lincoln-sourced 9 3/8-inch ring gear meant the rear end could absorb whatever ratio the customer chose without complaint. This attention to drivetrain detail separated the 7-liter from cars that simply bolted a big engine into an otherwise stock platform and called it a performance car. Ford had engineered the whole system to work together coherently, and that thoughtfulness showed in the way the car behaved on the road. Beneath the 7-liter's body, Ford made several meaningful chassis upgrades compared to the standard Galaxie 500. The suspension received heavy-duty shock absorbers and springs all around, plus a stiffer front anti-roll bar specifically calibrated to reduce body roll and sharpen the car's response during cornering. These were not token upgrades. They genuinely changed the character of the car in motion. The standard Galaxie of that era was tuned for comfort and isolation, the kind of soft, pillowy ride that Ford's advertising was comparing to a Rolls-Royce for smoothness and quietness. The 7-liter's suspension engineers deliberately moved away from that priority in favor of handling and control, and the result was a full-size car that could actually be pushed through a corner with some degree of confidence and reward. The standard rear end was a massive 9 3/8-inch unit shared with Lincoln and the Ford F-100 truck at the time, designed to handle the repeated torque loading that a 462 foot-pounds engine demands without issues. This was not a small car's rear axle. It was industrial-grade hardware installed because Ford knew exactly what kind of punishment the 428 would dish out. That standard equipment across the 7-liter also included power-assisted front disc brakes, which was genuinely advanced for a production car in 1966. Ford fitted 4-piston Kelsey-Hayes calipers on the front axle, and these combined with the larger rear drums to give the 7-liter stopping power that far exceeded what most of its competitors could offer. The installation rate for front disc brakes across all full-size Fords that year was only 3.3%, meaning the vast majority of Galaxie buyers never even considered the option. On the 7-liter, they were standard equipment, no extra charge required. Inside, the 7-liter was dressed in the kind of equipment that separated it from the basic performance cars of the day. Bucket seats were standard, along with a full-length floor console that stretched between them and housed the gear selector for the automatic transmission. A sporty simulated wood-grain 3-spoke steering wheel was standard equipment, the same design shared with the Mustang GT and the Fairlane GT, connecting the 7-liter visually to Ford's broader performance family, even while it occupied an entirely different place in the market. Wide oval tires on styled steel wheel covers, a prominent pinstripe, and low-restriction exhausts completed the package. The exterior was updated for 1966, with redesigned stacked headlights and 2 different grille treatments, a chrome die-cast unit for top-tier models and an anodized aluminum unit for the 500 series, plus quarter panels that carried a subtle kick-up to create a more modern Coke bottle profile. Ford also added a wind-split hood ornament, additional sound-deadening material that was notable even by the standards of the era's full-size cars, and a padded instrument panel, the latter being a nod toward the new federal safety awareness that was beginning to reshape the interior design of American cars. Additional padding and revised interior trim gave the cabin a notably richer feel than the base Galaxies, reinforcing the 7-liter's position as the top of the full-size Ford hierarchy. To Ann, the 7-liter was not alone at the top of Ford's corporate performance ladder in 1966. Over at Mercury, the Galaxie's upscale sibling, an equivalent model called the S-55, was offered to buyers who preferred Mercury's more premium image and slightly flashier exterior trim. The S-55 shared the same 428 engine in its standard form, where Mercury branded it the Super Marauder, and the same basic chassis hardware as the 7-liter. In many ways, the two cars were nearly identical under the skin, twin expressions of the same engineering philosophy aimed at slightly different buyers. The S-55 drew its name from the same tradition of sporty, full-size Mercurys that had been part of the lineup since the early 1960s, but like the 7-liter, it too found the sales environment challenging and would fade from the lineup in similar fashion as the decade progressed. On the road, the 7-liter delivered what it promised. With the standard 428 automatic combination, period testers recorded 0 to 60 times in approximately 8 seconds, while the quarter mile came in at around 15 seconds flat. Genuinely impressive for a car that weighed nearly 4,000 pounds and could seat 5 adults in comfort. The car felt effortlessly rapid rather than violently fast, the torque arriving smoothly and building in a long, confident wave that made overtaking at highway speeds feel almost lazy. For the rare customer who took delivery of the 427 version, the experience was dramatically different, more visceral, more demanding, more alive, but also far less practical for any purpose other than going as fast as possible in a straight line. Period road tests of 427-equipped full-size Fords recorded quarter-mile times in the high 13 and low 14-second range at over 100 miles per hour trap speed, numbers that made the 428 look domesticated by comparison. Ford priced the 7-liter at $3,598 for the hardtop and $3,844 for the convertible in base form. These were not bargain prices. A base Mustang Fastback could be had for right around $2,500, and even a fully optioned Mustang with the highest performance engine available at the time was considerably cheaper than a 7-liter. Across the street at Chevrolet, the Impala Supersport offered similar full-size muscle appeal with a range of big block options at competitive prices. The 7-liter was asking customers to pay a premium for something they could get cheaper elsewhere, or faster and more exciting in a smaller package. And that is precisely the tension that would ultimately doom the 7-liter as a standalone model. It was caught between two powerful forces pulling in opposite directions. On one side was the pony car and the intermediate muscle car, cheaper, lighter, and increasingly the emotional choice for performance-minded buyers under the age of 30. On the other side was the luxury car, where buyers wanted comfort, quietness, and prestige above all else. And Ford's own LTD was delivering that beautifully in the full-size segment without any performance pretense at all. The 7-liter was trying to occupy the ground between those two poles, and while it did so with genuine intelligence and genuine capability, the market gap it was targeting was narrowing by the month. The sales numbers told the story plainly. Of the more than 1 million full-size Fords built for the 1966 model year, the 7-liter accounted for just 11,175 units. That is barely above 1% of total full-size Ford production for the year. By contrast, the Ford LTD, the comfort-focused full-size luxury model that Ford had introduced alongside the 7-liter in a comprehensive lineup reorganization, was doing far better in terms of customer enthusiasm and repeat purchase intent. Ford's buyers were telling the company with their wallets that they wanted either the Mustang's youth and energy or the LTD's quiet sophistication, but very few of them wanted the 7-liter's specific combination of both. The competitive pressure from Chevrolet's Impala Supersport made matters worse. The Impala Supersport had been established in the market for several years by the time the 7-liter arrived, and its loyal customer base was not about to switch to an unfamiliar model name in the middle of the decade. Ford's brand recognition in the full-size performance space had been anchored to the Galaxie XL with the 427, and replacing that storied combination with a new model name and a softer engine, even a genuinely impressive softer engine, created an identity confusion that Ford's dealers struggled to articulate to customers on the showroom floor. There was also the shift happening within Ford's own racing program that undermined the 7-liter's credibility at precisely the moment it needed the opposite. NASCAR had changed its rules for the 1966 season, and the full-size cars that Ford had been running on the superspeedways were no longer the primary weapons in that battle. The intermediate Fairlane was now carrying Ford's 427 in NASCAR competition, getting all the publicity and the win counts that the big Galaxie had previously claimed. The 7-liter, despite its name and its 400-plus horsepower factory options, had no meaningful racing legacy of its own to market. It arrived at the moment the full-size performance car's moment in the spotlight was passing to the intermediates. By early 1967, Ford's internal product decisions had already been finalized. The 7-liter would not continue as a standalone model. Instead, the designation was quietly folded into the Ford XL lineup as a trim and engine package option rather than a distinct model in its own right. The XL itself continued with the 7-liter package available until it too faded from the lineup, and by 1968, the dedicated 7-liter badging had essentially disappeared from Ford's vocabulary. The 428 engine lived on. It eventually evolved into the legendary 428 Cobra Jet that debuted in April of 1968 in the Mustang, and later the Torino. But the 7-liter as a concept was finished after just a single year. The irony is that the 7-liter in many ways was ahead of its time, rather than behind it. The personal luxury performance car concept that it embodied, big engine, grand interior appointments, serious chassis hardware, exclusive model status, would become enormously popular in the 1970s, with cars like the Pontiac Grand Prix SJ and the Monte Carlo SS. Ford's own Thunderbird of the early 1970s would chase exactly this market with great commercial success. The 7-liter simply arrived before the market was ready to articulate what it wanted, or arrived just as the performance full-size era was ending and before the personal luxury era fully began. It fell into the crack between two chapters of American automotive history. Today, those 11,175 7-liters represent one of the more intriguing corners of the 1966 collector car market. Finding a survivor in good condition is genuinely difficult. Many were driven hard, many were modified, and the relatively modest collector attention the model received for decades compared to the Mustang and the GTO meant that fewer were carefully preserved. The 428 powered cars in clean original condition now trade for around $25,000 and upward depending on specification and condition, while the convertibles, rarer at 2,368 units, command significantly more. And then there are the 38 427 cars, some of which have disappeared entirely into the mists of history. The ones that have been authenticated and confirmed are legitimate 6-figure collector cars, representing not just a rare specification, but an almost impossibly specific moment in time, when Ford's most powerful full-size car met the very end of the era that made it relevant. A particularly extreme example exists among just two 1966 7-liter convertibles in the historical record that were delivered with the 427 R-Code engine and a 4-speed manual transmission, confirmed by Marti Auto Works research. One of those two was also painted in special order sapphire blue, a color reserved exclusively for Lincoln that year, making it a one-of-one car in terms of combined factory specification. Cars like that represent exactly the kind of obscure, ultra-rare combination that the collector world increasingly gravitates toward. Not just a surviving example, but a surviving example of something that almost did not exist even when it was new. What the 7-liter's story also reveals, perhaps more than anything else, is how a single product cycle in the 1960s could represent an entire arc of ambition, competition, compromise, and market reality compressed into just 12 months of production. Ford went from concept to showroom floor to discontinuation notice in essentially the time it took the rest of the world to figure out the car existed. The engineers who built the 428, who engineered the 9 3/8-inch rear axle, who calibrated the heavy-duty suspension, and who specified the Kelsey-Hayes disc brakes were not cutting corners. They were building the best full-size performance car Ford could honestly put together in 1966. The market just had other ideas. The 1966 Ford 7-liter was not killed because it was bad. It was killed because the world it was built for was changing faster than anyone at Ford had fully anticipated, and because the customers who might have loved it were being pulled in too many directions by too many more exciting alternatives. It was a brilliant answer to a question that the market had already started to ask differently, and Ford, practical as they always were about these things, recognized that reality and moved on. The 428 that powered it would go on to greater fame elsewhere, reborn as the 428 Cobra Jet in 1968, and eventually finding a new generation of admirers inside Mustangs and Torinos. But the 7-liter itself, the full-size Ford built around that engine, wrapped in genuine luxury and armed with serious chassis hardware, existed for only one model year, a quiet footnote in Dearborn's history that carries more weight the closer you look at it. But for those 11,000 buyers who made the choice to walk into a Ford dealership in 1966 and drive one home, they were getting something genuinely extraordinary. A full-size American car with 7 liters of torque-rich thunder under the hood, disc brakes, a Lincoln differential, a chassis tuned to actually handle, and a name bold enough to announce exactly what it was, even if Detroit's golden era was already beginning to close the curtain behind it.